Every time I come into the workshop, I tell myself I must tidy this mess up for the videos, but it's just sort of become the normal for the backdrop now. So let's carry on. Trivets, what are they? Well, traditionally, these are used in kitchens to put your hot pans and pots down on the surface, obviously without damaging your worktop. So these essentially go in between. They are there to provide protection, but they can be used in multiple places around the house and elsewhere. For example, putting a vase of flowers on a windowsill, one of these can go underneath it to protect the surface of the windowsill. So lots of uses, and from our point of view, lots of creativity in the designs that we can make for them. So it makes another great easy to make, easy to sell project. Let's dive in and take a look at the material selection. Now, this is quite a versatile job, which means that it can pretty much be done on any type of material. You could have something expensive like this purple heart on the bottom, a nice piece of oak, even a cheap piece of pine furniture board like I've got on top. You could, in theory, even do this on plywood and possibly get some amazing results with it. The main things we need to take into consideration really is the depth and the overall size. So with the depth, I would probably say no less than 1/2 inch or 12 millimeters, and probably no more than 1 inch or 25 millimeters. I'm going to go in straight in the middle of them with 3/4 of an inch or 18 millimeters with this piece of pine here. In terms of the overall size, this is dependent on the piece that you are producing. Obviously, it needs to at least be the same width as the piece that you're planning to make. But in theory, if you had a rectangular piece like this, consider making the most of the size of it. Yes, you could cut one straight out of the middle of this, but in theory, you could possibly cut two slightly smaller ones either side, and therefore make a much better use of that piece of material than having the wastage of just cutting one out. The only thing we really need to guarantee is that there are two good 90-degree corners on this. Now, we will be flipping the wood over. In this scenario, we're going to be flipping it over from left to right. So we need to just make sure that the two bottom corners are nice and square and 90 degrees, because ultimately that's what allows us to keep the wood in the same position every time we flip it over. Now, one thing I forgot to mention in the material segment was the complexity of your design versus the material that you choose. Now, obviously in today's episode, we're going to keep the design fairly basic and simple, but as you move on, you may do something that is more complex and have things like tapered, thinner sections. Now, obviously something like pine is likely to be more brittle than a hardwood, and therefore those thin sections in the pine are likely to break much easier. So just something to balance up in your decision. Now, before we move into the software segment of the video, let me quickly talk to you about CNCWITHME, conveniently on screen behind me. Now, obviously we're going to go through all of the steps in today's video to do this project, but if you're after a library of pre-built projects with all the files to make your life very easy and new projects that come out every week, it's definitely worth checking it out. It is a great community over there. They have forums to help you with your issues, discuss common things like feeds and speeds, as well as exclusive discount codes to use. There's also things like weekly podcasts and general catch-up chats that go on, so it's definitely worth checking out. And as you'll see on screen, you'll get 10% off with James Dean Designs discount code. Now let's dive into Carveco Maker, and hopefully I can teach you a few things that you've not used before. So in Carveco Maker, the first thing as always, we'll create a new model. We want the width of it to be 200 millimeters and the height of it to be 400 millimeters. We want the origin to be in the center of the material, and as always, leave the resolution on full. Click OK to generate the new model. Now, the first thing we want to do with the new model created is draw a straight line. So we come over to the polyline tool. We're going to just randomly click here and come across to the side. Hold down Control to keep this as a straight line. We're going to click to make the second point and then hit Escape, so we just have that single line. Now, what we want to do is replicate this several times, and these will be the lines with inside the trivet. So we're going to come up and use the Block Copy tool. Now in here, obviously there are a few options that we can adjust. So we're going to use the block copy feature, not the rotate, and we want to control the distance between the gaps. Now, the first piece of advice I will give is the minimum gap you'll want is at least double the width of your bit. So we're using a 1/4 inch bit today, so we want that to be at 12 millimeters at least. You can make it more. Obviously, the larger this number is, the wider the gaps will be between the lines. Now, we're only doing the X gap, so we can ignore the Y gap because we're just going to block copy these downwards. We're going to change the direction, as I mentioned, to be down. And we're going to come down to the amount of copies. Now, don't worry too much about the amount of copies. It's easier to do more copies of the line than you need than less copies, because we can always delete them later. So I'm going to leave this on at 20 and click apply. I'm then going to hit F9 to make sure these are all centered to the model. And then we're going to come over to the rotate tool and just adjust these to 45 degrees. As a quick tip, hold down Alt and it will adjust them in set increments. So with the inner lines drawn now, what we need to do is put a circle in the middle so we can cut all these to the correct shape. We'll come over to the circle tool, and you can obviously draw this by hand or use the measurement settings over here on the right. Now I'm going to leave the center point as 0 because we want this to be in the center of the model, and I'm going to make the radius for this 70 millimeters. Hit enter to create that. Now what we essentially need to do at this point is trim all of these excess lines around the edge of the circle, just so we're left with the inner lines. Now there are a couple of ways to do this. One of the most common tools may be the scissor tool over here to trim the vectors. Now to use this, simply obviously come up to the lines you want to get rid of, click on them, and it will delete them. But obviously to go around the whole circle and delete all of these would take a bit of time. So I'm going to show you a faster way. What we're going to do is select everything that is on screen. We're then going to come up to the vector merge menu and come down to the explode tool. Now what this does is literally every place that a line intersects, it will separate them into different lines. So I'm going to click this now. And what we can actually see is it's now broken all these up into individual lines. As I say, literally everywhere there's an intersection, it breaks them up into separate lines. Now, instead of deleting the lines we don't want, again, another quick tip, what I'm going to do is just select all the lines that we want to keep by dragging from the bottom right hand corner up to the top left corner. And we can see there it's highlighted all of the inner lines. We're now going to press Ctrl X, which is the cut feature. You can also come up to the edit and cut menu that would have been there. And then we're left with everything that we don't want. So what we can do now is highlight all of this and simply press delete. We can then press Ctrl V or edit paste to put this back in the position that we needed it to be. So obviously we can see straight away we've got the inner lines of the trivet that we need. Next we're going to come back over to the circle tool, and we're going to put a circle again in the middle of the material, in the middle of the model. So we'll leave that as 0, 0. But we want this circle now to be wider than the one we originally did. So instead of 70 millimeters for the radius, I'm going to put this at 90 millimeters. Click create and we'll put that in position. If I deselect everything, you can obviously clearly see what is going on in terms of we've basically created the outline for the trivet. And as I said earlier, in regards to the spacing of these lines, the larger the number you can space them out, you'll get a different effect. Ultimately, it depends what you are trying to achieve. But with that done, we can now create the toolpaths. First thing we want to do is create the toolpaths for the lines in the middle. So again, we will select all of those. We're then going to come up to the profile tool menu up here, and on the menu on the side we're going to change the profile type to along, and this gives us some options now obviously to adjust the start and finish depth. Now in terms of the lines in the middle, you want these to just be over halfway of the thickness of the material. My material is 18 millimeters today, so half of that would be 9 millimeters. So I'm going to make it 9.2 millimeters. Leave the tolerance as the default value as always, and we're going to select the profiling tool. Now to do this, I'm going to be using the Downtown Jenny, the 1/4 inch downtown downcut bit. So we will select that. We don't need any lead in or out moves, but I'm going to turn on ramping because this extends the life of your bit. These are my default values: 20 degree maximum angle, 5 millimeter maximum length, and a maximum start height of 1 millimeter. We don't need bridges on these. What we will do is define the thickness of the material at this point. So we're going to type in 18 millimeters, click enter, and then we're going to give this profile a name. We'll call this inner lines 1/4 inch downcut and click create. So that's generated the toolpath now for the inner lines. What we're going to simply do at this point is select the outer circle. We still need the same type of toolpath, the profiling, so we're just going to come back up to the top of this menu. Now technically we could leave this on the along option, but what I'm going to do is select it to the outside option. Now the reason for this is it gives us these extra options that we can see here, and I like the final pass allowance. If you're new to this option, once it has cut all the way through, it will take another very thin pass all the way around the outside just to clean up those tool marks that may have been left. We're going to come down to the cutting depth. Start depth remains as 0, but we want the finish depth to be 18.2, so it cuts through the full depth of the material. We're going to leave it on the downtown Jenny. You could add lead in and out moves if you wanted. I'm not going to put them on in this scenario, but I will leave the ramping moves. Now, in terms of bridges, I'm going to be holding this down with blue tape and CA glue, so I'm not going to add bridges. Obviously, if you want to add them, the choice is there. We're now going to change this to the outer line for the toolpath name and click calculate now. Now, obviously, if we generate the simulation for this, we can see what we have just created. I'll zoom in and tilt it around a bit. Now, obviously, what we can see on screen is we're having the inner lines cut and the outer lines cut. When we actually come to do this and export the toolpaths, we're going to do it in two separate ways. The first one is just going to have the inner lines on because we essentially need to cut this twice. Once in this orientation, and then we'll flip the material over left to right and cut it again. And this way you'll end up with the crisscross pattern with the holes that go all the way through. Also on the second pass, that is when we will do the outer profile cut to cut it out of the material. Now, I could technically show you at this point, but as I mentioned earlier, as we have a rectangular piece of material, let's look at cutting two of them out on the same piece. So I'm going to come back to the drawing area or the 2D view. I'm going to turn my toolpaths off and I'm going to move all of these vectors down to the bottom half of the material. With that done, I'm going to come up to the vectors menu on the top right hand side and we're going to turn off the layer that we can see and create a new layer. So we're going to click the outline of the toggle visibility bulb on the right hand side, turn all of those lines off, and we're going to create a new layer now for our second one. Now, we're essentially going to do the same, but remember, you can be as creative as you want with these designs. Now, we're essentially going to do the same again, but remember, you can be as creative as you want with these. So, for example, if you don't want to do straight lines, you could do wavy lines. And if you purchase the fluting toolpath pack from my previous video, you can also use all of these lines, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to drag this pre-drawn line in and just place it on the bed of the model. Obviously, that's coming extremely large, so I'm going to shrink this down to be a much more appropriate size and just press F9 to bring it back into the center of the material. As we did earlier, I'll come up to the block copy option. We'll leave all the settings the same as they are, except we want the direction to point down, and we'll duplicate this line. Probably way more than we need, but again, we will center this back into the middle of the material, come to the rotate tool, and adjust this 45 degrees. Come back over to the circle tool. Let's draw a circle again of 70 millimeters in the dead center. We will use the explode tool in the same way that we did earlier, just to break all of these vectors up. So that is vector, merge, and explode. We will then zoom in, take all of the lines that we need to copy, cut those out of place, select all the ones we don't want, delete, and paste the ones back in. So there we end up with our series of wavy lines. And again, we'll just come back to the circle tool, now do one at 90 millimeters, click enter, and there we are. We've just created another trivet in a matter of seconds in reality. Now what I'll do is move this one up to the top half of the material. I'm going to drag that up. If you hold down Alt, it will move it in a linear movement. So what we can do now is turn on the original layer with the other drawing on. We're going to expand the toolpaths menu down. We're going to double click on the inner line toolpath. Now obviously this will highlight all the lines that we used earlier. We want to add the new ones into this because it is exactly the same cut. So we're going to drag and select all of those, holding the shift button down as well. And now we can see it has selected all of the lines that we need. So we will recalculate that line or that toolpath. And there we have it. It has done the inside of both of those. Similar thing for the outer line. We'll double click onto that, select the second circle by holding shift down as well, just to add it to the selection, and recalculate that now. And just to be safe, we will simulate this, reset the original one, and redo the simulation. So there are the two designs that we have. What we need to do now is export the toolpaths. As I said earlier, we're going to do this in two parts. So we'll click back on the toolpath menu. We'll come down to the save icon, And what we can see is we have 3 toolpaths that are being generated. Now the second one is essentially the same. You just have this LP, which means last pass. That is that skim that I said around the outside to clean up any of the toolpaths. What we want to do to begin with is just drag everything back to the left hand side. You can use the double arrow to do this. Now for the first toolpath, we want to use just the inner line. So we'll bring that over and we'll call this Trivet Part 1, as you can already see down here before where I've been testing obviously for this tutorial. We'll click Save and generate that toolpath. And that is that one done. Now for the second toolpath, we need to bring in the outer lines, drag those over. That is the order you want to keep them in, the inner lines first, then the outer line with the LP for the final pass. And we will call this Trivet Part 2 and click Save. We'll close that down, and that is all the work done in Carveco. Now when it comes to the physical setup of the material on the machine, there are a couple of things we need to account for. The first is having some sort of reference guide or straight edge to guarantee that the material stays in the same position every time we flip it over. I have two options on my bed. I have a straight edge down here that can be taken out or put back in place. I also have this L bracket that's been machined out of acrylic, and these are both being machined to the actual CNC machine itself, so I know that they are 90 degrees and a square edge to the way the machine runs. If you want to know how to make one of these brackets and have this saved as a work reference point, there will be a link in the corner as say how to set this up. In terms of holding the material down, you've got the same options that we usually do. You can use something like clamps that I've got here, or you can use blue tape and CA glue. Now because we're only cutting all the way through the material on the second pass, what I'm going to do initially is hold it down with clamps to begin with. Then when I flip it over to do the cut throughs, I'm going to change over and use the blue tape and CA glue just to avoid using tabs in terms of the cutting. And the final thing is knowing the center of your material. The easiest way to do this, providing your material is square, is measure diagonally from corner to corner, and where the lines cross over, that should be the center of the material. In terms of putting your bit in the dead center of that, I often find it easier to do with a V bit first, align it up on the cross, then once you've set the 0 for that, you can change it back over to the end mill that we're going to use and reset the 0 for the top of the surface. So as I do have a rectangular piece of material, I'm going to cut 2 out of this. We're going to do one down the bottom, one up the top, but the setup for it is exactly the same. You just start in the center of the material. Once it's done the first pass, which is those middle lines that we need to take out, we're just going to flip this over that way, so left to right, right to left, put it back down in the exact same position and return to the start point where we can run the second part of the job, which is the same lines again, but obviously including the profile cut as well to actually cut it out of the material. So let's get the job started. Silly me, forgot to turn the microphone on for this section, but all I'm simply saying is the job has completed. We now need to release it, flip it over, hold it back down in the exact same position, but this time with blue tape and CA glue for the cutout. The board's now being stuck down with blue tape and CA glue. We've returned the bit back to 0. Obviously always check that the 0 is the same because we've switched from using clamps to blue tape. There possibly could be a slight thickness difference, so it's always worth checking that. But yeah, we are good to go now to run the second pass. So that's the job done. Let's get this all vacuumed up and get these released off the bed. Now for me, the designing and cutting is usually the fun part of the job, and the finishing off and waiting for things to dry is usually the part I don't look forward to. But let's take a look at ways to finish off your trivets and give them a bit of protection. So one of the nice things about using something like the Downtown Jenny is it leaves nice cuts straight off the bed. There's a little bit of fray in some of these gaps we'll need to get out either with sandpaper or a stiff brush, but ultimately the results are really clean. Couple of blue marks off the tape, but again a light sanding and these will be good to finish off. Now in terms of the finish, there are tons of varieties out there depending on what type of wood you're using, the grain pattern, etc. Some people may just revert to trying to cover these in linseed oil or another type of boiled oil. What I would say is we are intending to place hot objects onto these like saucepans and pots. You need something with a little bit more protection than just an oil, so maybe look at something like a poly oil or a varnish that, as I say, just gives the wood a bit more protection. I'm not going to go into specific brands because they can vary between country, but ultimately you say you want an oil with extra additives to give this a little bit more protection from the heat that it may encounter. Now what I'm probably going to do is darken one of these down with a stain, leave one natural, and then apply some sort of clear coating to them. So we'll come back once all that's been done. So we have the two finished pieces. The first one, I just gave this a clear coat with a spray finish. One advantage to the spray finish is it usually applies more even. However, the difficulty is trying to get it into all of the tighter spots, and obviously some of these cuts can be a little bit more difficult. Now with the second one, I used a finish that I have called Osmo. This is quite popular. It's come out darker than I wanted. The stain was, to say, a bit darker than expected, but ultimately, as I say, it gives a bit of contrast between the two different designs. This one was applied with a brush, so it allows me to get it into all of the tight spots, but equally you can sometimes get runs, so you have to be careful when applying it. I also did a third design off screen, which is this one here, and this has just been finished off with an oak stain and then a matte finish on top. Now when I was talking earlier about smaller tapered sections in softwood, this is the type of thing that I was on about. We can maybe just see that the corner has broke off a little bit there. Now ultimately, if this had been in hardwood, it may have come out a bit better, but there we have three products and we can see a contrast between them. So as I said at the start, easy to make and all being well, easy for you to sell. And just remember, these are only limited really by your creativity. Try different designs, different patterns, sort of any design that can be mirrored over and come the opposite way works really well with all the cutout holes that you end up getting. And you're not just limited to circles either. Consider things like hexagons, pentagons, even triangles, possibly even hearts. This was a bit of an experiment that I did. The cutout and design was pretty nice. Not sure on the finish. I charred it and then applied a stain on top, but yeah, you don't find out unless you experiment. So I do hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you did, please make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe if not done so already. Thank you all very much for watching. Final thanks as always goes to my patrons, and I will see you all on the next episode.